Yes, yes. Ready for a revolution, my friends. Well, we're going to be talking about the road leading up to the revolution today as we go through these review questions, as I promised to you. We're going to get right into it here in the interest of time. Number one, what were the names of the colonial wars that led to the French and Indian War, and what was the end result of each? All right, well, this is easy. Queen Anne's, King William's War. We've got King George's War as well. All of these are France versus England with various allies. In all of them, the British are able to defeat the French. So each time the British get an advantage over the French and are able to claim victory. So you're seeing a trend here as time goes by where the English are able to continue to take advantage over the French. Americans were involved in the last one, King George's War. Some of that took place in North America. Why were Americans frustrated? They were frustrated because they conquered portions of Canada during that war, and then as part of the peace treaty, they had to give it. England gave those places back to France. Americans were bothered by that because they felt like their contributions to the war were being ignored. So it's a good first step towards Americans growing more frustrated with the British and British rule. Number two, what were the immediate and long-term causes of the French and Indian War? Well, long-term cause was expansion, right? It was English expansion into French territory. That's because England's colonies are growing really populated really quickly. France was massive in terms of its empire, but it had very few people. And so as more English folks come to the American colonies, they begin to spread into territory that previously had belonged to France. That's going to be the long-term cause of the conflict. Immediately, if you remember, it's expansion into the Ohio River Valley. And that, of course, leads to George Washington leading a group of English soldiers into that area to knock out French forts which were being built to try to stop American expansion. Of course, those are the first starts of the conflict, and of course that then spreads throughout the American colonies, and eventually it spreads into Europe as well, becomes known as the 7 Years' War. Why did both France and England desire the Ohio River Valley? Well, it was fertile. It was a natural spot for both sides to expand into. There were large numbers of beaver there for the fur trade, and it was it was on the western frontier of the English colonies. So Americans viewed it as the next logical place to move into. A lot of fresh water, a lot of fertile land, and so therefore both sides wanted it. France had it. English settlers wanted it. And of course, that becomes the area that leads to the French and Indian War. What effects did the French and Indian War have on American and British relationships and policies? Well, they win, right? But if you remember, the Americans grow frustrated with with English leaders. They felt like they were mistreated by English leaders, especially generals. If you remember, some Americans engage in trade with France during the war, which irritates the English government. If you recall, there is English folks didn't think that Americans were respectful enough and didn't support the war effort enough with money and with troops. Americans argue that their contributions are not being recognized by England. Ultimately, the French and Indian War is a victory, but it leads to a lot of rifts between the English government and the American colonists. So it's the beginning of the split. It's the cause of what will eventually be the American Revolution. It's the earliest cause of what will eventually be revolution down the road. Policies, of course, we're talking about the Proclamation of 1763. That's a result of the war. Of course, Americans have a lot of problems with that. We'll get to that question down the road. Number 4, describe the 1763 Treaty of Paris that ended the French and Indian War. Well, England gains almost all of France's territory. Everything east of the Mississippi River and Canada, England gets. France gives everything west of the Mississippi to Spain, so France is basically removed from North America. They hold on to Caribbean islands, it's about it. So it's a massive victory for the British and a major defeat for the French. It makes basically Britain the undisputed leader in North America from that point forward. Number 5, what was the Albany Plan for Union and the Albany Congress, and what were its short and long-term goals? So In 1754, the American colonists met in Albany, New York. The short-term goal was to try to get Native Americans, especially the Iroquois, to support the British side against France. The Iroquois were neutral at the time, and so both sides knew they were going to need their natives to do a lot of the fighting in the French and Indian War. So it was a goal to try to get the English, to get the Iroquois on board and support the English side. While they were there, Benjamin Franklin, an American colonist from Pennsylvania, proposed what becomes known as the Albany Plan for Union. That was a much larger alliance. That was an agreement to try to get the colonists to unite and work together across colonies against common enemies. They mean the French, but down the road, the implication was they might work together against the English as well. So the short-term goal was to get the natives to support them in the French and Indian War. The long-term goal is greater unity, especially when it came to defense against Native Americans and against the French. It failed. It was not passed. It was not successful. There wasn't enough support in the colonies from enough colonies, and obviously the English blocked it as well. Number 6, who was the British Prime Minister in general that led the British to victory in the French and Indian War? Prime Minister is William Pitt. Remember, he takes over halfway through the war when things are not going well. He's able to get the support of the Americans because he focuses the war effort on North America, and he gives in to some American demands. He's not nearly as harsh on the Americans as previous prime ministers had been. The general's a guy named Thomas Wolfe. I don't think you need to know him, but he leads the British to victory. What was the most important battle of the war? It was the Battle of Quebec. The Battle of Quebec is when the British are able to, and the Americans are able to conquer Quebec, which was one of the two major cities in Canada. It's the capital, as you remember. When that happens, the French are really wiped out in North America, and then later on they're defeated in Europe and the rest of the world as well. Number 7, what was Pontiac's Rebellion? It's a rebellion of Native Americans led by a chief named Pontiac. It was located in the Great Lakes region and the Ohio River Valley. What caused it? Well, American expansion caused it. As Americans moved into the area, natives got more restless, they got more bothered by this, they got more concerned, and so Pontiac leads an alliance of Indians to try to wipe out American settlements in the area so that the Indian territories would not be threatened as much. What effect did it have in Britain? Well, of course, it led to great concern in Britain. Remember, Britain's already in debt after the French and Indian War, and then this breaks out, and they're forced to send troops, they're forced to borrow more money to put this rebellion down, and there's a belief that Americans are causing this, that American expansion is causing this, and it's not in the best interest of the English government to let it go on. That leads us to number 8. What was the Proclamation of 1763, and what effect did it have on American westward expansion? Remember, the Proclamation established what becomes known as the Proclamation Line. It's the peaks of the Appalachian Mountains, and what it says is, from this point forward, Americans are no longer able to spread west of that line. It was designed to slow American expansion or stop it so that more conflicts with natives like Pontiac's Rebellion would not break out anymore. What two groups what was American reaction to it? Well, it was negative, as you might expect. A lot of Americans ignored it. Other Americans intentionally defied it. And a lot of Americans grew increasingly frustrated with Britain and with British policies. Again, along with the French and Indian War, the Proclamation is really the beginning of the split between American colonists and the British government. What two groups formed partly in reaction to the Proclamation? Remember the Paxton Boys? The Paxton Boys were in Pennsylvania. They were guys that lived on the frontier, Scots-Irishmen, who openly defied the Proclamation. They would cross the line. They would attack Indians, really just to show their frustration with the British policy. The second group was the Regulators. They are not as famous of a group of defiant colonists. They really targeted their frustration on their own colonial government, but some of them also attacked Indians west of the line as well, and that's why we throw them into that. Really remember the Paxton Boys because they're the most famous example of defiance against the Proclamation. Most Americans didn't like the law. They broke it. They just continued to go westward anyways. But the Paxton Boys are a famous example of folks that used violence against natives, specifically in opposition to the policy. Number 9, you must be able to define and explain the importance of each of the following and how it contributed to the American Revolution. My goodness, there's a laundry list here. Let's get to the Currency Act. Remember, the Currency Act forbid colonies from printing paper money. It forced Americans to pay their debts in gold and silver. This was because Americans were paying debts to Britain in paper money, which was causing inflation. A lot of that money was valueless, and so it was a way for Britain to get more out of the American colonists than what they had previously been paying. Sugar Act is the first act imposed on the colonists by Britain. It, remember, added taxes to molasses and sugar. It didn't affect a lot of folks. It only really affected merchants that were bringing those goods into the colonies. The Quartering Act was a law that basically forced colonists to allow British troops to be quartered in their homes. Remember, Americans were bothered by this, one, because they had to pay the cost of it. Two, a lot of Americans felt like it was an invasion of their privacy, that the British government was spying on them and keeping a track of them so that they would not be rebellious. The Stamp Act, remember, the Stamp Act is a law that placed a tax on paper goods. It's passed in 1765, so a couple of years after the French and Indian War. Please remember, these policies, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, they were designed to pay for part of the debts that Americans had incurred during the French and Indian War that Britain was having to pay. The Quartering Act also was to get Americans to pay for troops permanently in North America. The British attitude is, hey, these troops are here to protect you. You should pay for part of their cost. The Americans basically thought it was a violation of their rights. The American responses to the Stamp Act, if you remember, they formed the Stamp Act Congress, which tried to unite colonial resistance against the Stamp Act. What did they do? Remember, they formed the Sons of Liberty, which was like the leaders of the protest. They passed non-importation agreements, which were, if you recall, agreements by Americans that they would no longer import British goods until the law was repealed. The Sons of Liberty's job was to enforce those policies by targeting merchants and others who were not following it. Another one is, remember, they sent a petition of redress to the King and Parliament explaining why the Stamp Act ought to be repealed. Let's go to the, by the way, it is eventually repealed, if you remember, because of the non-importation agreements. They hurt the British economy so much, the British government gets rid of it. The Declaratory Act was a law that was passed by the British when they repealed the Stamp Act. What it said was, hey, we may have repealed the Stamp Act, but we reserve the right to pass other acts on you in the future. So don't think you've won, Americans, even though most Americans felt like they had won the battle after the Stamp Act was repealed. The Townshend Revenue Acts, or the Townshend Acts as they were called, are a series of taxes that are passed now by one of the new heads of the government, Charles Townshend. They were taxes on a variety of different goods. Remember, Americans continue their rallying cry of no taxation without representation. One of the famous responses here is letters from a Pennsylvania farmer, which of course becomes known as the Massachusetts Circular Letter. And it basically said that colonists should not have to pay taxes against them. The only taxes they should have to pay are taxes that all British citizens have to pay. Anyways, we moved to the Boston Massacre as a result of the Townshend Acts and colonies' resistance to it. And remember, by the way, the colonies go back to non-importation again after the Townshend Acts. British troops are stationed in Boston because, remember, Massachusetts was the one that passed the letter and led the protests against the acts. So troops are sent there. While troops are there, of course, there is the situation where they fire on American colonists who are there kind of heckling them and messing with them. Of course, this becomes known as the Boston Massacre, as the American revolutionaries, the Patriots, use it as a form of propaganda to convince Americans that Britain is being harsh and cruel. After the Boston Massacre, remember, Britain is forced to repeal the Townshend Acts because of outcry in the American colonies. Fast forward a couple of years to 1773 and the Tea Act. The Tea Act, of course, is a tax on tea that is instituted by the British. Of course, the famous reaction to it is the Boston Tea Party, where the Sons of Liberty dresses as Indians, goes into Boston Harbor and throws the tea off of ships. Of course, the British government is outraged by this, and so they pass what become known as the Coercive Acts, or the Intolerable Acts if you were a colonist. These were acts that punished Boston and Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party. Remember, they lead to a ton of anger and outcry by the colonies because they were viewed as so harsh, so intolerable. While this is going on, there's another act you should be familiar with. It's called the Quebec Act. What it did was it opened up a lot of the land in the Ohio River Valley to French Canadian Catholics. And so remember, in Canada, there's a large number of French speakers there that are holdovers from when it was France, when it was owned by France. And so what Britain does, in an effort to slow down American expansion into the Ohio River Valley, they open up the Ohio River Valley to French-speaking Catholics. Americans were bothered by this. One, they thought the Ohio River Valley should be open to them instead of French-speaking Canadians. Two, they're especially bothered that Britain is choosing French speakers and Catholics over English-speaking Protestants in the American colonies. Anyways, the Intolerable Acts, if you recall, leads to the First Continental Congress. At the First Continental Congress, if you remember, the Americans have a number of colonies that are there, not all of them. They then form they write another series of grievances known as the Declarations and Resolves. They go back now to non-importation, but this time they also include non-exportation. So they cut off all trade with England to protest the Intolerable Acts. Short time after the First Continental Congress is formed, we have the famous battle at Lexington and Concord. Remember, the British send troops out from Boston into the Massachusetts countryside looking for weapons and leaders of the Sons of Liberty. While they are there, they get into a skirmish with American Minutemen at Lexington. Eventually, they move on to Concord, where it turns into a larger battle. Eventually, the British are forced to retreat back to Boston. Lexington and Concord, significance, of course, the first shots of the Revolution. We move over to the Second Continental Congress, which was formed in response to Lexington and Concord. Now even more colonies are represented. They write something called the Declaration for the Causes of Taking and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. Now it's another petition explaining why they've done what they've done at Lexington and Concord. At the same time, they try to issue something called the Olive Branch Petition, which is a final request to the king to hear their pleas. They want to remain British citizens. They want to remain peaceful. But of course, that does not happen. 1776, a year or two after the Second Continental Congress, the Declaration of Independence is finally written. Remember, it is written after the Battle of Bunker Hill and because of something called common sense, which we'll get to down below. Number 10, who were the major military and political leaders on both sides during the road to revolution? Military leaders, really, let's focus on political leaders. George Grenville, Charles Townshend, right, are really the leaders of Britain, along with King George, in the road leading up to the revolution. Americans, you've got Thomas Jefferson, of course, the writer of the Declaration of Independence. You've got Ben Franklin, a man who had been calling for unity for many, many, many years, right? You got Samuel Adams, you got John Adams. Samuel is the head of the Sons of Liberty. John is a famous patriot and speaker for the government as well. Military, it's Washington, who's going to be named leader of the Continental Army. Those are probably the names that you really need to know. Number 11, who was Thomas Paine? What was common sense and why was it so influential? Thomas Paine was an American propagandist. He wrote a famous pamphlet known as Common Sense. It really appealed to colonists that they needed to declare independence, that they could not accept peace, that there was no going back. Remember, he made arguments like the king was a brute. He made arguments that the colonies were too large to be ruled by Britain. A lot of Americans read it. It was a bestseller. And most importantly, a lot of the members of the Continental Congress read it, and it convinced them to accept revolution once and for all. It's considered a key step towards the Declaration of Independence. Prior to that, most Americans did not support independence. After Common Sense, they do. What were the strengths and weaknesses for both Great Britain and the colonists in the Revolution? First, Britain. Their strengths are they have a professional army. They have a large army. They've got the Indians on their side. They've got some slaves on their side. They control the seas. They have the Navy that controls the seas as well. And so they control the coastline. The weaknesses, the American colonies are huge, so they can't occupy all of them at the same time. Additionally, the Americans know the land. The Americans are fighting for a more moral cause than the British. Ultimately, Britain doesn't have very strong political or military leadership during the war. The colonies, well, their strengths are what we kind of just talked about. They have the moral high ground. They grow strength over time, while the Loyalists and the British lose strength over time. They control the countryside. They're excellent shots, if you remember. They have the support of the rest of the world. At first, just kind of on the down low. But as the war goes on, they get more and more support from France and other countries. Weaknesses for the Americans is they didn't have a lot of money, especially until France gets involved. They were poor, they were broke, and so they're fighting on a shoestring budget, which really slows down their success. Another strength for the Americans is Washington. Remember, they have great military leaders like Washington. They also have great political leaders as well. Number 13, where were the first shots of the American Revolution fired? Technically, Lexington and Concord, right? And then Bunker Hill, remember, is the first major battle. After Bunker Hill, the king officially declares the colonies in rebellion, and he hires those German Hessian mercenaries to come over and to fight. Oops. 14, what were the British and American strategies to win the war? Remember, the British would like to capture the leaders of the rebellion. They would like to capture areas, I guess you could say, that they thought were the most important to American patriot causes. So they focused on New England first, because that's where the patriot cause was strongest. After Bunker Hill, remember, they moved down to the middle colonies. They try to cut the American colonies in half by seizing the middle colonies. Eventually that fails after Saratoga, and so they are forced to head to the southern colonies, which is their last area of support. Eventually, after the Battle of Yorktown, they lose that as well, and they're forced to surrender. American strategy, remember, is to fight a war of attrition, is to just drag the thing on as long as possible, and to achieve enough victories to get the French or another foreign country to help them out. They know they can't win the war by themselves, and so they really try to focus on bringing France in or another country. France helps out with money at first and eventually sends not only armies but navies to help the Americans after the Battle of Saratoga. Question 15, what happened to Boston, New York, and Charleston during the Revolution? Those are three of the largest four cities in the American colonies. They were captured by the British. Remember, the British control the sea. They control the coastline. They can land troops anywhere they want to with the protection of their navy. And so they're able to seize the major cities, and they think that's going to be the key to victory. But remember, they can't seize all of them at the same time, first off. Secondly, the Americans just move into the countryside when that happens, and they continue the struggle, they continue the fight from there. So it's the story of the British really controlling the coast and the cities, but once they move into the countryside, they lose all control and they start to suffer defeats. Number 16, what were the two most important battles of the American Revolution and why? It was the Battle of Saratoga, midway through the war. It's the turning point. After the Americans win that, it brings the French in. The French believe the Americans have a chance to win, and it's worthwhile enough for them to support the Americans in order to make the British weaker. The other major important battle is the Battle of Yorktown. That ends the conflict. It ends the fighting. It's the final defeat for the British in the South. So remember, Saratoga's in the middle colonies. It's halfway through the war. It brings the French in. Yorktown is the final defeat for the British. After that, they really have no more armies left to fight. And remember, by that point, they're fighting a world war against France and the Netherlands and Spain. And so when they lose at Yorktown, they cannot really recover. 17, what were the events at Trenton and Princeton so significant? We're going to skip those because we don't need them. The point is, hey, Washington was critical to victory. He was able to achieve a number of victories when things were really low for the Americans, and he really keeps the war effort going during tough times. That was why he was a master. That was his greatest trait or strength as a leader. 18, what role did women, African Americans, and natives have in the American Revolution? Women were critical to the American victory. They generally didn't fight alongside men. They didn't, but what they did was they ran farms, they ran businesses while the men fought. Remember, women did sewing or knitting drives, they did baking drives, they did everything they could in order to help the soldiers on the front lines. And they kept the businesses and farms going. African Americans, remember, tended to... I should say, really, like African slaves and natives, they tended to fight with the British because in both instances, African slaves and natives viewed the Americans as their greatest problem. Britain promised freedom to African slaves and land back to natives if they helped them during the war. Obviously, those did not happen. 19, what were the details of the Franco-American alliance and what effect did the alliance have on the outcome? Remember, France, when they signed it, it happened after the Battle of Saratoga. France agreed to recognize the United States as an official government, and they promised to fight with the Americans until the war was over. They gave military and financial aid to the Americans so that American success could happen. What were the effects? Absolutely critical. If it isn't for France, the U.S. does not win this war. That's how important they were. 20. Describe the course of the war from 1775 to 1783. Think 3 parts. All right, I already mentioned this. First third of the war, Britain focuses on New England. After the Battle of Bunker Hill, they change and move down to the middle colonies to try to cut the Americans in half. When that fails at Saratoga, they move down to the southern colonies because that was their last area of support. So think from top to middle to bottom. That's the course of the war. Americans just chase the British each time and eventually tire them out. 21, what were the final terms of the 1783 Treaty of Paris? Remember, there are 2 treaties of Paris, one that ends the French and Indian in 63, one that ends the American Revolution in 83. The Treaty of Paris in 1783, Britain gives up all land up to the Mississippi River, so everything east of the Mississippi now becomes a part of the United States. If you remember, Americans agreed to, Britain also agreed to abandon forts on the western frontier. My dog obviously is not a fan of that. He is whining and barking in the background. He must be British. Actually, he's German, so he probably would have sided with the Hessians. So the British give up those forts, or they promised to, and they give up all the land east of the Mississippi. What did the Americans agree to? They agreed to give loyalists back their land, or at least pay them for the land and property that had been seized by the Patriots during the war. The Americans never do that, by the way. Then again, the British never abandoned those forts. And each of them used those excuses as to why they didn't have to follow through on their side of the deal. Number 22, by the way, how did that affect the map of North America? Well, England has Canada, but that's it. Spain has everything west of the Mississippi. The U.S. now has everything east of the Mississippi River. 22, what American individuals earned measure of artistic or cultural acclaim in the 18th century? We have a few. Ben Franklin was considered something of a famous person, a famous writer. He wrote an almanac known as Poor Richard's Almanac. Thomas Jefferson was considered to be an expert architect and writer as well. There's a famous lady named Phyllis Wheatley, a former slave, who becomes America's first poet during the 1700s as well. 23, who were the Sons of Liberty, and what 2 ways did they support the start of the Revolution? Wow, well, that's a good question, first off. So the Sons of Liberty, remember, were a patriot organization made up of radical patriots whose job it was to, a few things. One, their job was to enforce the non-importation agreements. So they were responsible for forcing merchants to not bring in British goods. It hurt the British during the Stamp Act crisis. It hurt the British during the Townshend Acts as well. And so that was one way that they assisted. They were also responsible, remember, for the Boston Tea Party, which is another major step towards the Revolution as well. They oftentimes led the resistance in many American cities, especially Boston, during the war. And so, British kind of considered them a terrorist organization. Remember, they were doing things like tarring and feathering people and things like that who did not support the Patriot cause. So they're an important example of a group that really helped to spark resistance to Britain during the war. 24, what was the idea of Republican motherhood that existed following the Revolution? Remember, women were calling for women's rights. We read something by Abigail Adams where she called on John to guarantee women's rights. Instead, what men did is they created the concept of Republican motherhood. It said that a woman belonged in the home so that she could raise children to be patriots and support patriot values in the generations to come. So it basically argued that women were more moral than men, that they were better suited to raise children, and that they were specifically better suited to raise patriots in the generations to come. So it was a way to really force women to accept the role in the home by basically redefining what it meant to be a mom and a woman by saying, hey, your job is to be in the home to raise patriot children so that our next generations follow the same standards and beliefs that we had during the Revolution. Just another example of women getting jacked by men. Number 25. What agreement had to be reached before the Articles could even be ratified? There were disputes over lands out west. Some colonies had a huge amount of land out west that they thought belonged to them. And so the government had to convince those colonies to drop their claims out west to the land. And when that happened, enough colonies, some of those colonies refused to sign the Articles until that happened, until the land was given to them. When the government's able to convince those colonies to drop those land claims and to ratify the Articles, that's finally when it happens. That's why it took 4 years, because some of the colonies refused to sign it until land out west was given to them. Eventually, the government is able to convince those colonies to drop their claims. 26, what were the major weaknesses of the U.S. government under the Articles? Oh my God, there's a bunch. One, they didn't have the power to tax, so they were always broke. They didn't have the power to regulate trade between colonies, so it led to a bunch of disputes and tariffs and hostilities between colonies. They couldn't protect the border, right, on the western frontier they couldn't stop they couldn't remove the British from the forts. They couldn't stop the British and the Spanish from encouraging raids. They lose control of portions of the Mississippi River to the Spanish, including the port of New Orleans. They're being harassed by the British on the open seas. Britain's forcing them to follow the navigation laws, even though they're no longer British. The French are pissed because the Americans can't pay back their debts, and so they cut off trade with the Americans as well. Remember, the Spanish wanted territory out west that they thought belonged to them. The Americans didn't give it to them, so they're encouraging India to tax and cutting off New Orleans to them. The Barbary States are messing with American ships when they come into the Mediterranean Sea. They're seizing Americans and holding them for hostage and seizing their cargo. So the Americans have a lot of problems, and they can't seem to really respond to any of them, largely because they're so broke. Also, remember, Shay's Rebellion, right, is another one as well. So I kind of just answered 26 and 28 together. 27, what were the two major successes of the Articles? They both involved land. There was a land ordinance of 1785, which sold pieces of land out west to help pay off the debt. The other one was the Northwest Ordinance, which established rules for statehood. It also banned slavery north of the Ohio River, so it created a bunch of free states later on. So those are the successes. There weren't many others than that. 28, I really just talked about the British, the Spanish, the French, and the Barbary States. Those are the foreign challenges that were being experienced domestically. Remember, colonies wouldn't work together, they wouldn't unite. Shay's Rebellion breaks out, which is the next question as well, and that's a major domestic challenge. 29, what were the causes and significance of Shay's Rebellion? Well, remember, Daniel Shays is a Revolutionary War leader. He and fellow farmers have never gotten paid for their service. They get behind on their taxes. They are borrowing money from banks and having their land seized when they can't pay it back. So they march on courthouses in Massachusetts and across New England. They burn some of them down. They remove judges. Remember, the government can't stop it, and so the rebellion goes on for months and months. Eventually, wealthy Americans raise their own army and put it down that way. It was a wake-up call for many wealthy, land-owning Americans who realized if something wasn't done to fix the Articles, they might lose their land down the road as well. 30, what was the Annapolis Convention, and why was it significant to the new Constitution? Well, remember, before Shay's Rebellion, which actually occurred in 1787, the Annapolis Convention had formed, and the Annapolis Convention was designed to try to fix portions of the Articles. Not enough states showed up, all right? Remember, only like 5 showed up, so they didn't even have a majority to be able to fix the Articles. So Alexander Hamilton, the guy that ran it, canceled it and said, let's come again back together next year in Philadelphia. Then Shay's Rebellion breaks out in between, and then the next year when they meet in Philadelphia, there's a lot more support to change the Articles. 31, what sort of people made up the delegates at the Constitutional Convention? White, male, educated, generally wealthy, and so, you know, it's by folks who were scared by Shay's Rebellion. Those are the ones who really are responsible for the new Constitution. 12 of 13 colonies were represented, if you remember. Who were some of the most important figures there? Gosh, George Washington was the head of it. James Madison, remember, is the father of the Constitution because most of his ideas become the basis for our new government. Ben Franklin was there. Alexander Hamilton was there. They were leading supporters, as was John Adams, of the new Constitution. 32, what were the major compromises reached at the Constitutional Convention? What were the terms of each? There were two major compromises. One was what's called the Great Compromise. Remember, populated states wanted something called the Virginia Plan. Now, this has to do with how many representatives each country is going to have, and each state's going to have in the new government in Congress. Large states like Virginia that had a lot of people wanted it to be proportional, which meant number of representatives would be determined by your population. They would have a lot more. That meant small states would have a lot fewer. Small states did not like that. They liked how it was under the Articles, where everybody had an equal number of representatives. The compromise was known as the Connecticut Compromise, and they took ideas from both the large state plan, which was the Virginia plan, and the small state plan, which was the New Jersey plan, and they created the Connecticut Compromise. Two houses. The Senate is based on equal representation for every state. The House of Representatives is based on population, so more populated states have more representatives. That was a way to compromise to get the Constitution ratified. The second major compromise is the 3/5 Compromise. Remember, African slaves were counted as 3/5 of an American citizen, of a white person, for population. Southern states were not going to ratify the Constitution if they did not get credit for their slaves. Northern states did not want to give them full credit because slaves did not have rights and freedom like other Americans. And so instead, they give them 3/5 credit for each slave in order to get the Constitution ratified as well. Number 33. How did the Constitution correct the weaknesses that had plagued the Articles? Well, it created an executive branch to enforce laws. It gave Congress the power to tax. It gave Congress the power to regulate interstate trade. If you remember, it made national laws supreme over state laws. So now the national government has sovereignty, which means rule over the states instead of the other way around. As a result of these fixes, the Americans are going to be able to respond to a lot of these problems that existed. Number 34, and by the way, it also forced states and people, individuals, to follow laws. If they did not, the executive branch could enforce. Lastly, Guinea, what is your problem? Lastly, the Supreme Court was created, the judicial branch was created to resolve disputes between the states and the federal government, and they were given absolute power over lower courts, over state courts to make the final decisions. Number 34, what arguments were made by both Federalists and Anti-Federalists during the ratification debate? Well, remember, Federalists argued that we needed a stronger national government in order to control the states. They argued we needed an executive branch in order to enforce laws. They argued we needed a judicial branch to decide matters between the states. Anti-Federalists were states' rights guys, right? So they thought the government, was too powerful. They thought the executive branch would abuse its power and authority and bring tyranny to the colonies by abusing its power. They argued the states ought to be supreme. Remember, the Federalists represented wealthier groups. They represented the East Coast. They represented the cities. Anti-Federalists tended to represent the lower classes, and they tended to represent farmers and folks that were scared by federal power, by national power. What group of people made up the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and who were some of the leaders? I already mentioned who was made up of them. The leaders of the Federalists are the guys that wrote the Constitution. So Madison, Hamilton, Washington was a Federalist, although he didn't speak very much on the matter. Leading Anti-Federalists were Thomas Jefferson and people like Patrick Henry, who thought that it gave the government too much authority. 36, what was the purpose of the Federalist Papers? Who wrote them? Federalist Papers were written by Hamilton and Madison. The goal of them was to convince people to support the new Constitution. It gave arguments why the Constitution needed to be ratified. It criticized anti-Federalist arguments. And it was an important tool to get some of the states to agree to ratify the Constitution. 37, what agreement was reached that permitted the Constitution to finally be ratified? Remember the agreement for a Bill of Rights. Anti-Federalists wanted a Bill of Rights added. They wanted specific rights and freedoms mentioned in the Constitution that weren't there. When Federalists agreed that a Bill of Rights would be added once the Constitution was ratified, enough Anti-Federalists supported it that the Constitution finally gets passed, it finally gets ratified. Remember, small states ratified right away. Larger states like Virginia, like Massachusetts, like New York, those were the real test, because if the big states did not, then there was no hope that they would get a majority. Remember, the article said that a law had to have unanimous support. Had to have 2/3 support, and an amendment needed unanimous. The framers knew they couldn't get that, so when they wrote the Constitution, they said you only need 2/3 support for amendments to the government, and you only need 50% of the public to pass a law. I should say 50% of Congress. So in order to get 9 of 13 states to ratify the Constitution, they had to change the rules. And it was important to get the big states like New York, Massachusetts, Virginia to support. The only way they were going to do that is if they added a Bill of Rights, which was something that Anti-Federalists demanded. Folks, that's it. Hopefully that helps you out. As you are reviewing, we're testing on Thursday. I hope that the content part of it helps you. Of course, you still need to know the the documents. You need to be able to analyze the documents and find the arguments in there because the content will only get you so far. Mr. M signing off here with the, the James Madison to my Alexander Hamilton, right? Or to my George Washington, to the George Grenville, to my King George, right? To the Bill of Rights. Guinea is the Bill of Rights to my Constitution. And he is happy to be here and making an appearance on the camera. Ginner, anything to add here before I before I turn it off and let these people go? Are you hungry? You're just chilling now. You were whining and barking earlier. Now all of a sudden you're in my arms and... Can I get a kissy? Oh, thank you. All right. I guess he's the Abigail to my John. All right. Vice President Guinness signing off here. And along with Mr. M. Have a great day, folks. Hope this helps. Thursday.